Welcome to Millennium Counseling Center's podcast, where each week we go in depth into all things mental health, addiction recovery, and being our healthiest and happiest self. Enjoy.
Well, I was having an interesting conversation the other day about comparisons, about, people comparing yourself to other people and using that as a way to kind of, I guess,
Measure?
like measure how you're doing
Yeah.
in life. And I think people generally know that's not a positive thing to do, or it's not a helpful thing to do, or it's whatever you want to. And particularly in the world of therapy and things like that, I think that that's a common theme that, comparisons aren't necessarily good for you. But then the questions are, why is that? Right. So I think people understand that they probably, that that's not the healthiest thing to do. But then also digging into that a little bit deeper as to, okay, well, why is that? And we had, some interesting back and forth about that, about why that's a healthy thing or an unhealthy thing, or something that helps you or doesn't help you.
Yeah. I try to see it from a couple different perspectives, where one is a way to make you feel not enough, and one as a way that kind of unlocks some kind of desire or passion or something more motivating within us. Because we only know what we know, or we only have what we have. And then we look around us and we say, well, I want to learn more about this, or I want to have something more like that. And I think that's when comparisons can be more motivating, right? Like, what do I need to do in order to have that degree or have that kind of job or be like this in a relationship? So I think there's some action around that where, when we look around and we see something that could kind of spark some kind of drive within us to say, hey, look, that's really interesting to me. I want to learn more about it. But then the other side, that is kind of more about not enough, shame, guilt, is other people have more, are better, are something, and I don't have that, and I probably won't ever have that. And then what does that do to us?
Well, yeah, and I think you're right. I think our instinct is that it creates action, right? That's what it does, is if I want something more, then I'm going to get into action and do those things. And what we see, or at least what I see over and over, is that, and it's similar to the idea of, like you said, of using kind of like shame or guilt as a motivator, right? That if I feel terrible about something, then I won't do it anymore. Or if I think that I have a worse job than somebody, then I'm going to work really hard to get that job. So in theory, and I think to a level that can work, right? That can be helpful. If you are, a sports team and you see the other team lifting up the championship trophy and you say you don't feel good about the fact that you're holding the little one, the little trophy, then you say, hey, I want to do that, right? So that does work to a certain extent. So that I agree with. And at the same time, I think if you look at kind of, if we're just talking about trying to get to a really healthy mental space, right? And what does that look like? And I'll even talk about, like, in recovery and the world of substance abuse, when people get sober and go into recovery, is that it's finding this balance of feeling good about yourself while mixed with humility. So it's like, I feel strongly about the way I'm living my life. I feel good about that. But at the same time, trying to make sure that you remain humble, and that increase in self-esteem or confidence doesn't lead to arrogance or overconfidence or cockiness, I guess. And so the way I look at it is that if I'm comparing myself to others, and you're going to fall in one of other places. You're very rarely going to come in at the same level when you compare. So it's either that I'm less than or I'm more than. And I think from a high level, I'm not sure either of those are really overly helpful. They either think that I'm better than everybody or worse than everybody. I don't know that generally helps us.
Hearing what you're saying, I think someone would have to prioritize or place value on interpersonal relationships. Because for me, humility is about being able to be a part of other people's lives in a certain way where they want to be a part of it. Whereas cockiness, ego, arrogance tends to push people away. It's not as attractive to want to have interpersonal relationships. So you would have to value wanting to be close to people in order to bring in humility. Whereas if you want to just to quote unquote be the best in whatever it is, and you aren't valuing that, then it's probably really hard to see the value or to have the desire to not just keep pushing and trying to quote unquote be better or have more than others.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you said about wanting to be close to people, right? I think that people are attracted to confidence. People are attracted to, even at some level, to arrogance or cockiness. I think people are interested in that and are drawn to that. But the key part of what you said is having close relationships, right? So I think that can bring attention, right? So you have the opportunity to maybe engage with people or to kind of get to know people. But the question is do you want to have really close relationships with people where then that becomes a negative, right? Like, people are attracted to confidence, but then if you get there, they get to know you and it's overconfidence, then that's unattractive, right? So it's that balance of, and that's why I kind of use a word more like self-esteem or something like that, because I think people are attracted to people who feel good about themselves. And yet there's a fine line between being drawn to that to get to know that person and then being pushed away because of a sense of overconfidence or arrogance.
Well, and we started talking about comparison and what is a driver of comparison? Like what drives us to see it through that lens? And for me, it's really a measuring stick of how well are we doing. And I think that's a tough thing in today's age where, I think we probably feel better if we value ourselves based on how many people we have in our life or how close we are to people. But then what our eyes are drawn to other things, right? How often are you going on vacation? How healthy are you? Like, what does your family look like? What kinds of things, material things do you have in your life? And so, again, that kind of turns into this kind of internal struggle of what am I really comparing and how does it really fit into what I value as a good life?
Well, it's funny. My dad, who passed away last year, had a lot of very wise, as parents do, had a lot of very wise things, some of them very funny and some of them very helpful. But one of the things he said to me since I was a little kid was, he said, no matter how good you are at something, there's always going to be someone better. And no matter how bad you are, there's always going to be someone worse. And I think that was helpful for me because his point was that you don't ever want to feel like you're the bottom of the barrel, but you also have to be careful of feeling like you're standing on top of the barrel. And so I think that, to go back to your first point, I think wanting to move up that in whatever you're trying to achieve can be a motivator for you, right? But then, just like anything, when you get to the extremes, then on either end, then that can be dangerous. And I think that it comes back to a word that we use a lot, which is balance, right? And finding that range that I guess makes sense for each of us.
Well, it's something that I try to practice when I'm walking my dog, in my neighborhood, walking past other people's houses and seeing other people do their life. As much as I'm drawn to kind of what they're up to, I really, before I'm done with that, really try to kind of bring back and where am I at my life, right? And what do I have and how do I really try to place value that this is where I am. If I think that there's something missing right now, then I'm probably going to bed feeling like I'm more set up to compare. But no matter what anyone else has or doing or whatever, like I think for me, it's that checking in and reset of that there's a level of enoughness. And no matter what I want to strive for, that at the end of the day, that wherever I am on any given day, that has to be enough for me.
Yeah. And as you know, as someone who knows me, I think personally, I think a lot in numbers, right? Like math makes sense to me. So, one of the things that I do in my own journey to become the best version of myself, when I'm taking any particular subject, like let's say working hard, right? My first question is, I ask myself, what would be ideal on a 1 to 10 scale? If 10 is that I spend my entire life working and 1 is I don't ever do anything, what is ideal for me? It changes per person, but what is ideal for me? So for me, I would say, if I'm off the top of my head, I would say a 9, right? That's ideal. I believe in hard work and I believe in going after things that you like. Now, that might not be ideal for other areas of my life, but that, if I'm setting a goal, that would be that. And then I ask myself, and this is where it's really difficult to be totally honest with yourself, is where am I on that? Right. And so if I'm an 8, if ideal is a 9 and I'm an 8, then I need to start working harder or more. If ideal is a 9 and I'm a 9.5, then I have to try to scale back on that a little bit and look where I could create more balance in that regard. And so I think that instead of, what I try to do, instead of comparing myself to someone else and say, like, this other person's a 10 and I'm a 9.5, I better work harder. I try to understand what would be ideal for my life and for how I feel about myself. And if I can identify that, it makes it really clear as to which direction I need to move in. And then once I know what direction I need to move in, then I can put some things in place to try to accomplish that and try to do that.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's ultimately the work that I experience with clients is, whether it's sobriety or financially or kind of internal acceptedness or happiness, it is just a measure within ourselves. 5 years ago, I used to be a 4, and now I feel like a 7 most days. Oh, that's an improvement, right? Or, I used to not be able to be sober for longer than a month, and now I've been sober for a year. Like, so again, not that has any kind of relevance to anybody else's life except our own. So as long as we keep checking in with ourselves and where are we at with what we're valuing, and if we're not, then how do we address that within ourselves, not necessarily look outside of ourselves to do anything about that?
Yeah. And I think the other thing about using other people to compare, kind of where you are in your life is that there's two things. There's what appears to be on the outside, what someone else is or has or whatever that is, and then the reality of what is truly there. And many times it's really difficult to understand that about someone else's life. So I think that that's another aspect of it where when using other people to kind of assess where we are in the world when it comes to anything, then I don't know that we have true information as to what we're comparing ourselves to. And many times, you look at people talking about the issues these days with social media and why that's bad for kids and why that causes problems. And they did a study where they asked people basically, I think this was 16 to 24-year-old young women, I believe was the study they did. But then they asked them where they compare to the rest of the world, like basically asking what percentile is your life in overall. And these were people who had said they were heavy social media users. And the answer was like the 12th percentile. So that means the average person thought that 88% of the people their age had better lives than they did. So I think that's one of the dangers of social media is it's like a highlight film of other people's lives, but it doesn't really give you a true picture of what's going on in all of our lives. And most people are posting things that are going well in their life, which is great. At the same time, you have to be careful to think that most people are cruising around in their yachts in the Bahamas when that's not necessarily the case as to what really the general population is really living like.
Yeah, and no shade on the Bahamas, by the way.
Yeah, I love the Bahamas.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point that you're really talking about is think about how much other people really know about you, right? And that's probably a similar amount of what other people are allowing you to know about them. And so it's a really kind of interesting way of reframing kind of where are we and where do we want to go? And it's taking some of the attention away from what other people are doing, or at least kind of how we think about what other people are doing, and more how are we doing and what is important to us, and how do we keep focusing on that?